They lost their daughter, then their grandchildren, then their home. What they found next could have made them rich, but they chose something else. Welcome to the story room. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Section 1. The Eviction 1000 Words. Let me tell you about William and Margaret. They were the kind of people who believed in family above everything else. The kind who would give their last dollar to help someone they loved. And that's exactly what they did for 8 long years. William had worked his whole life as a construction foreman in Denver, Colorado. Strong hands, weathered face, the kind of man who measured his worth in honest work. Margaret had been a school nurse, the person kids ran to when they scraped their knees or needed someone to listen. Together, they had built a simple, good life. Then tragedy struck. Their daughter Emily died in a car accident, leaving behind 3 children. William and Margaret didn't think twice. They took those kids in, raised them like their own, loved them with everything they had. For 8 years, they paid school fees. They covered rent when the kids got their first apartments. They bought groceries when money was tight. They showed up at graduations and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday dinners. They gave and gave and gave, because that's what love looks like. William kept every receipt in an old shoebox under the bed. Not because he wanted to be repaid, but because he needed proof that the years were real. That his daughter's children were cared for. That he had kept his promise to her. But then something changed. The kids grew up, got good jobs, started their own lives. And slowly, quietly, they disappeared. First, the phone calls got shorter. Then, the visits stopped. Then the texts became one-word replies. Finally, there was just silence. Margaret still kept her phone nearby, screen brightness turned all the way up, checking it every few minutes. Waiting for a name that never appeared anymore. Some nights, William would find her staring at old photos, tears running down her face, and she'd quickly wipe them away and pretend she was fine. The rent came due. Then it came due again. And again. William sold his father's old pocket watch, the one he'd carried for 30 years, and told Margaret it was no big deal. But his hands shook when he handed it to the pawn shop owner. On a cold Tuesday morning in October, the landlord's lawyer arrived with 2 men and a locksmith. Neighbors peeked through their curtains. One woman whispered to another, "I knew those kids would abandon them." Nobody helped. Nobody wanted to get involved. William carried their bags down 3 flights of stairs, one at a time, because Margaret's knees weren't what they used to be. She held the railing with both hands, taking each step carefully, and at the bottom, she turned back to look at their apartment door one last time. Like maybe this was all a mistake. Like maybe someone would come running to stop this. Nobody came. Outside, their belongings sat on the sidewalk in neat piles. Their whole life reduced to boxes and bags. William called the first grandchild. Straight to voicemail. He called the second. No answer. He didn't bother calling the third. He already knew. Margaret pulled her coat tight around her shoulders. "So this is how it ends," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. William stood there on that cold sidewalk, feeling older than he'd ever felt, when he noticed a faded notice stapled to a telephone pole across the street. His eyes caught one line. County auction, abandoned properties, starting bid $50. $50. That's all they had left in the world. Everything else had gone to rent, to food, to keeping a roof over their heads for as long as possible. William stared at that notice like it was a life raft in the middle of the ocean. Margaret followed his gaze. For the first time that day, she stopped crying. The auction happened in a dusty county office that smelled like old papers and forgotten dreams. Plastic chairs squeaked against the linoleum floor. Most people there were house flippers looking for deals, or locals hunting cheap land to sell later. Nobody paid attention to William and Margaret. Old people have a way of becoming invisible, especially when they're poor. When the auctioneer held up the listing for a cabin 40 miles outside Denver, William raised his hand. $50, he said, his voice steady. Nobody else bid. The auctioneer looked around the room, shrugged, and banged his gavel. Sold. Margaret squeezed William's hand. Not in celebration, but in shock. It felt strange to win something when everything else had been taken away. They didn't know it yet, but that $50 cabin was about to change their lives. Not because of what it was, but because of what it held. And more importantly, because of what William and Margaret would choose to do when they found it. The taxi driver who took them to the cabin kept glancing in his rearview mirror like he was worried about them. When they finally pulled up to the property, he whistled low. "You folks sure about this?" he asked. William nodded. The driver helped them unload their bags quickly and drove away fast, gravel crunching under his tires. The cabin looked like it had given up years ago. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. Paint peeled off in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. One window was boarded up from the inside. The porch steps leaned to the left. But it was theirs. And after sleeping in their car for 2 nights, even this broken-down cabin looked like hope. Margaret walked through every room, her footsteps echoing on the bare floors. She touched the walls, checking for strength. She counted the rooms, mapped out where things could go. Finally, she came back to where William stood in the doorway. "It's standing," she said simply. That was her standard now. Standing meant it could be saved. Standing meant they could survive. They chose the upstairs bedroom because the floor felt more solid there. William pushed the old metal bed frame into the corner, testing each leg to make sure it wouldn't collapse. Margaret wiped down the dresser with her sleeve, leaving clean streaks through years of dust. That night, the forest made sounds they'd never heard before. Branches cracked. Something moved near the porch. An owl called out, lonely and distant. Margaret lay awake listening to every sound, her heart jumping at each one. William pretended to sleep beside her, but she could tell by his breathing that he was awake too. Days fell into a rhythm. Margaret cleaned what she could with borrowed supplies. William fixed what he could with tools he found in the shed. In town, people talked. "Did you hear about that old couple who bought the condemned cabin?" someone would say. Another would reply, "They won't last through winter." Word travels fast in small towns. Sympathy travels slower. On the 4th day, it rained. Not a gentle rain, but the kind that finds every crack and leak in an old house. Water started dripping through the ceiling, then pouring into the basement. William grabbed a flashlight and headed down the narrow stairs. The basement was dark and cold, smelling like earth and time. He walked carefully, shining the light around, looking for where the water was coming in. That's when he noticed something strange. One wall sounded different when the rain hit it. He stopped, listened more carefully, then tapped the wall with his knuckles. Hollow. It sounded hollow. He tapped again in a different spot. Solid. Then back to the first spot. Hollow. His heart started beating faster. William pressed his palm against the wall. It felt dry. Too dry for a basement with water coming in everywhere else. He ran his hand along the surface and felt something. A seam. Very faint, almost invisible, but there. "Margaret," he called up the stairs. "Can you come down here?" She appeared at the top of the stairs, worried. "What is it? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I think there's something here." The next morning, William borrowed a hammer and pry bar from the hardware store in town. The owner gave him a long look but didn't ask questions. Small town courtesy meant minding your own business. Back at the cabin, Margaret stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, arms folded, watching. She'd learned over 50 years of marriage that when William got quiet and focused, something important was happening. William tapped the wall again, mapping out the hollow section. Then he started carefully chipping away at the old plaster. Each piece that fell revealed something underneath. Not just wall, but a patch job. Someone had sealed this section deliberately, carefully, like they were hiding something. "Be careful," Margaret said softly. He worked slowly, dust floating in the beam of his flashlight. After about 20 minutes, the pry bar slipped into a seam that shouldn't have been there. He pulled gently, and a whole panel shifted. Behind it was a door. A small, narrow door with no handle, painted the same color as the wall. You'd never know it was there unless you were looking for it. William and Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Neither of them moved. The basement felt colder suddenly, or maybe that was just their imagination. "Should we open it?" Margaret whispered. William looked at her. After everything they'd been through, after being abandoned and evicted and left with nothing, they'd found something. Something hidden. Something secret. He reached for the edge of the door. It opened with a groan, hinges protesting after years of being sealed shut. Inside was a small room about 6 feet by 6 feet, and it was full of paintings. The hidden room was nothing like the rest of the basement. It was dry, insulated, carefully preserved. Stacked along the walls were dozens of paintings wrapped in protective cloth and flat wooden crates tied with old twine. Everything was labeled in neat handwriting. Dates. Names. Places. William stepped inside carefully, his flashlight moving from one label to another. 1944, Paris, he read aloud. 1946, Amsterdam. 1943, private collection. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She'd spent enough years around schools and libraries to know what old, carefully preserved things might mean. William, she breathed, don't touch anything. But William had already leaned closer to one painting. Even through the protective covering, he could see rich colors. Deep blues and golds. The kind of painting you see in museums behind velvet ropes. His hands started shaking. Not from excitement, but from something else. Fear maybe. Or the weight of knowing that what you do next matters. These aren't just old paintings, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. These are hidden old paintings. Someone went through a lot of trouble to hide these here. William backed out of the small room slowly, like sudden movements might break whatever spell was keeping this moment suspended. They stood in the basement together, staring at the open door, neither of them speaking. Upstairs, voices drifted through the window. 2 hikers were passing by on the trail that ran behind the property. I heard someone actually bought this place, one said. Some old folks. Probably got scammed. The other laughed. Probably filled with junk. Old people love holding on to junk. Their voices faded into the distance. Margaret sat down on the bottom step, her legs suddenly weak. If these are valuable, she said carefully, they belong to someone. William nodded. He thought about the eviction notice, about sleeping in their car, about the grandchildren who'd disappeared, about how easy it would be to take these paintings, sell them quietly, and finally have enough money to be comfortable. Maybe even enough to get revenge by showing everyone what they'd found. His chest felt tight. Then it eased. We call the police, he said. Margaret looked up at him, searching his face for doubt. She found none. A small smile touched her lips. Good, she said quietly. I didn't raise a thief. And I didn't marry one either. That night, neither of them slept. William kept thinking about those labels, that careful handwriting, the effort someone had taken to preserve those paintings. Margaret kept thinking about choices. How the biggest ones happen when nobody's watching. In the morning, William made the call. His hand shook as he dialed, not from fear of getting in trouble, but from the weight of choosing to do the right thing when the wrong thing would have been so much easier. The police officer who answered sounded skeptical. You found what in your basement? Paintings, William repeated. Old ones. Hidden behind a false wall. I think they might be important. There was a long pause. We'll send someone out. The first police car arrived an hour later, moving slowly up the gravel road like the officer wasn't in any hurry. A young cop stepped out, looked at the cabin, then at William and Margaret. You're serious about this? He asked, one eyebrow raised. William didn't explain. He just led him to the basement and showed him the wall, the hidden door, the small room full of carefully wrapped paintings. The officer's expression changed instantly. He pulled out his radio. I'm going to need backup. And call the state police. We've got something here. Within 2 hours, the cabin was full of people. More police. Then people in suits who weren't police. Investigators. Art experts. Someone from the FBI. They moved through the basement carefully, taking photos, writing notes, handling everything with gloved hands. One woman, an art historian from the Denver Museum, unwrapped one painting partially and went completely still. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up with tears in her eyes. Do you know what this is? She asked William. He shook his head. This is a Monet, she whispered. A real Claude Monet. It's been missing since World War II. Her hands were shaking. There are dozens more down here. If they're all authentic, this is one of the most significant art recoveries in decades. William felt the ground shift under his feet. Not from excitement. From the crushing weight of understanding what they'd almost kept hidden. What they could have stolen. What they'd chosen to give back instead. Margaret found his hand and squeezed it. They stood together, watching strangers catalog their discovery, and felt strangely at peace. They'd done the right thing. And somehow, that was enough. The cabin was sealed off that same evening. Yellow police tape fluttered against the peeling paint. News vans started arriving the next morning. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to them suddenly wanted to know everything. "What did you find?" they asked. "How much is it worth?" William and Margaret didn't answer. The county put them up in a small trailer nearby while investigators worked. It rattled in the wind, and the heater barely worked, but it was warm enough.
And it was free.
Days turned into weeks. People in suits came and went, asking the same questions over and over. William and Margaret told the truth every single time. No, they didn't know the paintings were there. No, they hadn't touched anything except to discover them. Yes, they called immediately. No, they didn't want anything except to do the right thing. The stories spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up first. Then national news. Elderly couple discovers art treasure hidden in cabin, the headlines read. Radio hosts made jokes about grandparents stumbling into fortune. People online had opinions. Lots of opinions. "They should keep it," someone commented. "After what they've been through, the world owes them." "They're fools," another wrote. "Could have sold it privately and been millionaires." Margaret heard some of these comments when they went into town for groceries. She heard the whispers, saw the looks. She kept her head high and said nothing. William thought about how fast people's opinions changed when money entered the picture. When they were being evicted, nobody cared. Now, everyone had something to say. The investigation took 3 months. Art historians flew in from New York, from Los Angeles, from Europe. Carbon dating was done. Provenance was traced. Every painting was photographed, cataloged, authenticated. Finally, the truth came out. The collection had been stolen during World War II by a Nazi officer who'd fled to America after the war. He died in the 1970s, and somehow the paintings had stayed hidden in that cabin all these years. The original owners, Jewish families from France and Poland, had lost everything. Most had died in the Holocaust. But some descendants were still alive. The total value of the collection was estimated at over $15 million. William heard that number and felt nothing. No excitement, no regret. Just a quiet sense that they'd helped return something stolen to people who'd lost everything. That felt more valuable than any amount of money. But then a letter arrived. Official government letterhead, legal language, lots of signatures. William read it 3 times before he believed it. Because of their immediate reporting, because of their cooperation, because of their honesty, the state was awarding them a finder's fee. 10% of the recovered value. $1.5 million. Margaret sat down slowly when William told her. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. "It's real," William said softly. "Legal.
Clean.
Ours." "I know," Margaret whispered. I wasn't expecting this. Neither was I." They sat together in that rattling trailer, holding the letter, not quite knowing what to feel. They'd done the right thing because it was right, not for a reward. But here it was anyway. That's when the phone call started. Unknown numbers, voicemails, text messages. The grandchildren had heard about the money. The first one left a tearful message. "Grandma, Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I've been dealing with so much stress at work. I should have called.
Can we talk?"
The second sent a long text full of explanations. "Bad timing. Life got crazy. Didn't mean to lose touch. So proud of you both. Can I visit?" The third called directly, crying. "I made a terrible mistake. I love you both so much. I want to make things right." William listened to every message. Margaret read every text. They didn't respond right away. They needed time to think, time to feel, time to decide who they wanted to be now that everything had changed. Money changes how loud people talk, Margaret said one evening. But it doesn't change who they are. Or who we are. William nodded. He felt no rush to respond. No desperate need for their approval or presence. Something had shifted inside him during those months of silence. He'd learned that he could survive without them. That he and Margaret were enough. They'd been tested in the quietest, cruelest way. Abandoned when they needed family most. And they'd passed that test not by being bitter, but by staying true to themselves. Now came a different test. What would they do with this money? How would they respond to the grandchildren? Who would they choose to be when they had the power to choose? The answers, William realized, would define the rest of their lives. William and Margaret agreed to meet the grandchildren. Not at the cabin, not at their trailer, but at a quiet diner in town where everything felt neutral. Public enough to stay civil. Private enough to be honest. The three young people arrived together, probably for moral support. They looked nervous.
Guilty.
One carried flowers. Another brought a card. The third just looked like they'd been crying for days. William and Margaret sat across from them in a corner booth. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone at the counter was talking too loud. Life continued around them, ordinary and indifferent. The oldest grandchild spoke first. "We're so sorry," she said, and her voice cracked. "We got caught up in our own lives. We didn't mean to abandon you. We were just busy." The second one nodded quickly. "We should have called. We should have helped with rent. We just thought you'd be okay." The youngest couldn't even speak. Just cried silently into a napkin. William listened to every word. Margaret watched his face, noticing what was missing. No anger. No desperation to be understood. Just a quiet sadness that came from accepting a painful truth. "I forgive you," William said finally.
Simple as that. 3 words.
The grandchildren looked up, hope flooding their faces. But William continued, and that one word changed everything. "Forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to how they were. You left us when we needed you most. You didn't answer calls. You didn't help. You disappeared." Margaret spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "We lost our home because we spent everything on you for 8 years. We never asked for payback. We just wanted family. And when we needed family, there was nobody there." "We know," the oldest said quickly. "And we want to make it right. We want to be there for you now. We want to help." William shook his head slowly. "You want to help now that there's money. Where were you 3 months ago when we were sleeping in our car?" The table went silent. Someone dropped a plate in the kitchen. The sound echoed through the diner. "We love you," William said, and he meant it. "We'll always love you. But love doesn't mean giving you access to our lives again. Not right now. Maybe not ever. Trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. You lost ours." The grandchildren left that diner with red eyes and heavy hearts. Margaret felt sad watching them go, but not guilty. "We did the right thing," she said. "I know," William replied. They returned to the cabin, which was finally theirs again. The police tape was gone. The investigators had left. It was just a cabin again. Their cabin. With the money from the finder's fee, they fixed everything properly. New roof, strong floors, insulated walls. Fixed the basement so it would never flood again. They kept it simple though. No mansion. No luxury. The cabin had held them when nothing else would. It deserved their respect. But they didn't keep all the money for themselves. Margaret started making calls to local shelters. "How many elderly people do you see who've been evicted?" she asked. "How many have nowhere to go?" The numbers were heartbreaking. Dozens. Every month. Grandparents abandoned by family. Elderly people pushed out of homes. People who'd worked their whole lives ending up on the streets. William met with lawyers and accountants. They created a foundation. The Hidden Room Project, they called it. Emergency housing for evicted elderly. Food assistance. Legal help for people fighting unfair evictions. Nothing flashy. Nothing with their names on plaques.
Just help.
Words spread slowly, the way real things do. Not through headlines, but through people who suddenly had a place to sleep. Through families who found legal help. Through elderly folks who weren't alone anymore. Sometimes neighbors stopped by the cabin. "You're doing good work," they'd say. Margaret would smile and offer coffee. William would thank them and change the subject. They didn't want praise. They just wanted to help. Months passed, then a year. The grandchildren reached out occasionally. Emails. Cards on holidays. William and Margaret responded politely, but kept their distance. Maybe someday there would be healing. Maybe not. Either way, they were okay. One evening, William sat on the porch, watching the sunset through the pine trees. Margaret came out and sat beside him, handing him a cup of tea. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Calling the police instead of keeping the paintings?" William thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "If we'd kept them, we would have become people we're not. We would have lost ourselves. But we would have been rich." "We are rich," William said, gesturing to the cabin, to the forest, to the life they'd built. "Just not in the way people think." Margaret smiled. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky orange and pink and purple. They'd been discarded. They'd been tested. They'd found treasure and given it back. And in doing so, they discovered something worth more than any painting or any amount of money. They discovered that integrity, real integrity, is what you do when nobody's watching. When it would be easy to do the wrong thing. When you have every reason to be bitter. William and Margaret chose differently. They chose to stay true to themselves. And that choice, that simple choice to do right when doing wrong would have been so easy, that's what made them truly wealthy. The cabin stood strong behind them. No longer condemned. No longer forgotten. Just a home where two people proved that character isn't built in moments of celebration. It's built in moments of loss, when you decide who you'll be when everything is taken away. And they decided to be good. The end. When integrity is tested in silence, character speaks the loudest. William and Margaret remind us that doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when life has been unfair, that's what defines us. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that goodness still matters. That honesty still wins. That character still counts.